Hello everyone, and welcome to a weekly reading update that is actually just going to be an in-depth review of my complicated thoughts about She Who Became the Sun, because that's the only thing I've read over the past not just 2 weeks, but like the past 3. As you probably know, I moved recently. I only moved about an hour down the road. I moved in order to be closer to my new job so I wouldn't have to do that hour commute every day, but it was still a lot to deal with. And I've also been having more troubles than usual with my sleep disorder. I have this sleep disorder. They think it's idiopathic hypersomnia. Basically what that means is I'm just like exhausted all the time, and so I've been trying out new medications for it, and that's been just frustrating, and it's been a journey. So haven't been doing very much reading, but we're going to talk about She Who Became the Sun. She Who Became the Sun was the Elsewhere Book Club pick for July. It actually worked out really well that I'm posting this reading update on July 31st. Because of that, I'm not going to be keeping my review as spoiler free as I usually do, since I know many of you are in the book club and probably also read it this month. Like I said, I have complicated thoughts that I am still untangling, so I'm going to focus this review in 2 parts. In the first part, I'm just going to give you my regular boilerplate. Do I think you should read this book? Do I think you shouldn't? That will be spoiler free, so if you haven't read the book yet, you can check that part out. And then the second half of this review is going to be a more in-depth look at some things that I've been pondering regarding this book, specifically its treatment of gender, because I have a lot of thoughts about how this book deals with gender, so that will be part 2. Okay, so She Who Became the Sun is often pitched as Song of Achilles meets Mulan. The reason people pitch it this way is because it is the gender-bent story of a particular emperor from Chinese history. So we get this idea of a woman, or at least somebody who is biologically female, dressing as a man and living more or less as a man, kind of like Mulan. And then at the same time, this book deals with a lot of queer themes, a lot of genderqueer themes, so you get those parallels from the Song of Achilles. That said, I don't think it's a good description for the kind of experience you will actually get if you dive into this book, because really She Who Became the Sun is a military fantasy, and neither Mulan nor the Song of Achilles are actually military fantasies, despite taking place during wars. So what do I mean when I'm talking about military fantasy? What can you expect to get from this book? You get a ton of descriptions of battles. You also get a ton of military strategy and political infighting between factions. So be prepared for that. I wouldn't necessarily say that this book is an uber difficult read exactly, but you do very much have to be keeping track of things and keeping your brain turned on. I saw some people in the Elsewhere Discord saying that they wished they'd had like a plot summary to follow along with because there are a lot of moving pieces, and I agree with that. I think that is really handy. If you can find one, that might be very helpful to you. Where this book is the most successful, in my opinion, is when it comes to Shelley Parker Chan's writing style and the way that Parker Chan chose to structure this novel around 2 characters who are foils for one another. We follow Zhu, who I have talked about a little bit already. Essentially, the premise of the book is that Zhu's brother is fated for greatness. Zhu herself is fated for nothingness, but when her brother dies, she decides to take on her brother's fate, and that's why she decides to dress and live as a man. She goes to a monastery, she is educated in this monastery, and then eventually she ends up falling in with a group of rebels called the Red Turbans. Opposite her, you have the eunuch General Wu Yang, and if I didn't quite pronounce Wu Yang right, please let me know. I am not a Chinese speaker, I have done my best, but I'm not sure. Wu Yang is a eunuch. He is also a general of a Mongol force, and what is really, really interesting about him is the way that he interacts with the hyper-masculine society around him, because, you know, Wu Yang has been castrated, he's a eunuch, and so in the eyes of some of the people around him, he is incomplete, and he is not really a man, right? So both he and Zhu struggle with falling short of their society's ideals of masculinity in certain ways. So the 2 characters are opposite one another. They are protagonist and antagonist, and they are also foils that refract gender and ideas of gender in different ways. And in a lot of ways, that's what this book is about. Its center of gravity is the question, what does it mean to live as a man? Now we come to the second part of this review, because I thought Wu Yang was more successfully drawn in that respect than Zhu. Before I jump into this though, I want to add a caveat, because I recognize that Parker Chan himself is non-binary and has written on Goodreads very openly about how this book was written in part to express Parker Chan's own experiences with being a non-binary person in a binary world. And so I feel like I'm kind of in this double bind, and I want to be very consider it, I guess, because I recognize that this topic is something that seems to be very personal to Parker Chan, but at the same time, as somebody who is not inside of Parker Chan's head, as a reader who is coming to the text solely as a text, there were times when I thought that these themes were not developed as fully as they could be. Ouyang, I loved as a character. I mean, obviously I didn't love him as a person because he does a lot of bad things, but like as a character, he was my favorite character. I loved reading his chapters. He has such a complex psychology that I think Parker Chan was able to put a really fine point on. He feels very precisely and specifically drawn. Ouyang sees himself as a man, but an incomplete one, right? He's a eunuch, and he is always pushing against people who see him as feminine or as an incomplete man in some way. Like, he is always constantly rubbing up against the way that people see him and how he really, really dislikes it and he hates what has been done to him. This means that he's also really misogynistic, and there's a really wonderful scene where a character points this out to Ouyang and points out, no, you don't necessarily like love masculinity and you don't necessarily love men. You just really, really don't like women because you don't like the way that you feel like you have been forced into a more feminine life and world. And that's complicated, and it's very, very specific to this particular society, this fictionalized version of the Mongols, and how they view what is essentially an intersex condition. And I think that's what I really liked about his chapters, is that they feel not necessarily like someone just took our categories from today and ported them into a fantasy world. They feel realistic to this fantasy world. Certainly they don't necessarily use the terms that we would use, and again, Ouyang is misogynistic because he's not perfect and he's really struggling with hating himself, and so that hate is directed outwards. But it all happens in a way that I think makes a lot of sense for 14th century fictional China. Zhu, to me, did not feel necessarily as well integrated into a complex yet whole psychological profile. The way that Zhu thought about gender did not always quite cohere to me. And again, I want to be very careful here because I recognize that Parker Chan is themselves non-binary and has written about drawing from their own experiences to write this novel. So I don't want to say that I think that the way Zhu experiences gender is wrong or anything like that, but I think what I am saying is that the way that it's presented in the text, when it comes to what is actually on the page, sometimes Zhu's experience of gender felt gender essentialist, not in a way that was organic to the story, not in a way that felt like, oh, well, the society is gender essentialist. So I'll give you an example. There is a moment in the story where Zhu has been living as a man for a while. There are people who realize that Zhu is not necessarily biologically male, but still treat Zhu as a man. But then Zhu is going off on like doing a mission for the Red Turbans, and she sees a woman who is pregnant. The narrative makes a point that this woman isn't showing yet. She doesn't have a baby bump, but Zhu is just able to like realize that this woman is pregnant because of her like woman pregnancy sensing abilities. And how this is played is that Zhu, in her own thoughts, is habitually casting aside any reference to her past as a girl. She is bound and determined to take her brother's fate, to make her brother's fate her own, and so she thinks of herself as a man. But in this moment, she is unable to sort of tamp down the, I guess, like, internal womanness inside of her, and this distresses her because it's a point of tension, right? She wants the great fate, but inside of her, she's like, oh no. So on the one hand, it makes sense, but then on the other hand, it kind of doesn't to me. I get why Parker Chan made this choice, but at the same time, it just feels like the narrative is saying like, oh yes, well, if you are born a woman, then clearly you have pregnancy sensors. So it has this weird gender essentialist texture to it for me, which, to be clear, I am not trying to imply that Shelley Parker Chan is a gender essentialist or thinks in a gender essentialist way, because I don't think Parker Chan does at all. I just think that the narrative sometimes puts these things forth. And I don't know, maybe this shouldn't bother me as much, because Yang has something kind of similar going on, right? Where he's like a misogynist, and he's a misogynist because of his opinions about masculinity, which are not great, and he learns as he goes through the novel and stuff. And so maybe this sort of streak of gender essentialism I'm seeing is just Zhu's streak of gender essentialism. But I think maybe that's the disconnect, because Zhu as a character feels particularly non-gender essentialist. She never wavers in her certainty that she can put away the womanly side of her, that she can become her brother. She can become Zhu, the man. She never wavers in that certainty. Eventually, by the end of the novel, she does recognize that she's not necessarily like within the traditional binary construction of gender in her society, and she moves beyond it. But she never really seems like somebody who has any problems with, I'm going to put on this cloak of manhood. I'm going to become a man. And so then when there are these pieces where she's like, oh, I guess I recognize that this woman was pregnant because, I was born as a lady, it doesn't quite feel integrated into her character. I think that's why it feels weird to me. I don't know. I'm still trying to untangle my thoughts about this. I welcome your thoughts. I especially welcome your thoughts if you're trans or non-binary. I know there are many of you in this community, because I'm dumb and cis, and so sometimes I miss things. But it just, I don't know, felt a little weird to me. And so I loved Yang's chapters. I thought he was absolutely fascinating. I did find Zhu a very compelling character. I think the reason I'm being so nitpicky is because I thought Parker Chan really was a great character writer, and I enjoyed the book overall. I gave it 4 stars.